Hi everyone, the game we're going to look at today is a classic from 1970 and it's the USSR versus the rest of the world match, and this game takes place on board 1 between Larsen of Denmark and Boris Spassky of Russia, who is the current world champion. So Boris Spassky had become world champion the year before, 1969, by beating Tigran Petrosian, and on his way to the title he'd beaten Larsen in the semi-finals quite convincingly. And so now they meet again. In this event, Larsen had insisted on playing top board ahead of Bobby Fischer because Bobby Fischer had had a few years off competitive play. And people were quite surprised that Bobby Fischer actually agreed to this. And he did very well on board 2, beating Tigran Petrosian with 2 wins and 2 draws. The first game between Larsen and Spassky in this match had ended in a draw. And this game we're going to look at is the second game with Larsen as white, and he opened with 1b3. And this opening became known as Larsen's opening. He'd been playing it since 1968 with a high number of wins, although it has to be said that his opponents in these games were players that you'd have expected him to beat. When he'd come up against some stronger players, he'd had a couple of losses, namely against Najdorf and Portiche, and here he gets a try against a world champion. So, Spassky replies at e5, seizing the centre, and Larsen logically plays bishop to b2, attacking the e5 pawn. Spassky plays knight c6, developing move and protecting the e5 pawn, and then c4 is played. So he plays c4 to make it more difficult for black to play d5 and really dominate the centre. So Spassky plays another developing move, knight f6, and then Larsen plays knight f3. And this move deserves a question mark already. The normal move nowadays is just e3, which keeps the option of playing a knight to e2, and if say something like bishop to c5, then you can play knight f3, and if e4, d4, and suddenly it's white who's got the space advantage. If you take the knight, recapture the bishop, and if you look at white's bishops, they're both on the long diagonals. Any attempt to free this bishop will allow us to exchange off this doubled pawn, and the knight can go to c3, and then either e4 or d5. But back to the game. Knight f3 was played, and this just invites Spassky to gain space, and he plays e4, knight to d4, and Spassky just develops again, threatening to win the knight. So the knight captures on c6, the d pawn recaptures, opening up this diagonal for the light squared bishop, and black stands better here. He's ahead in development, he's got more space, and out of his 6 moves, Larsen spent 3 of them on his knight, going to f3 to d4 and then capturing on c6, and that knight's been removed from the board. Larsen's also got some problems developing here, and he plays e3, preparing to play d4, which would free up his position. And Spassky replies with a really good move, bishop f5. This bishop might look a bit awkwardly placed at the moment because it's blocked by its own pawn, but it's stopping white from playing d4 because we can just take en passant and then the d3 pawn is protected, and it's getting the bishop off the back rank so that after we move a queen we can castle. Larsen replies with queen c2, and I don't like this move too much either. So Larsen's aiming at exploiting the fact that this bishop is unguarded. Spassky plays queen to e7, preparing to castle queenside, and Larsen plays bishop to e2, preparing to castle kingside. So Spassky castles, and then Larsen plays f4. And this was the idea behind queen c2. Black can't take the pawn en passant because queen takes bishop with check, and white gets a grip on the e5 square as well as the d4 square now. However, there's an obvious downside to this. Black's ahead in development, white's king's still in the centre, and he's just opened up this diagonal. And Spassky wastes no time. Knight to g4, and now we can see ideas of queen to h4 check, and there are also some ideas of sacrificing on e3 to keep the white king stranded in the centre. Now in the game, Larsen played g3 to keep the queen out of h4, but if white just tries to get rid of a knight with bishop takes, and we see queen check, g3, queen takes, and then all these white squares are really vulnerable now. There's no bishop to defend them. For instance, queen to d1, looking to exchange off queens, queen to h3, preparing to come into g2, queen e2 to protect against that, rook to d3, loading up against his e3 square, and if say bishop was to take on g7, If the other rook comes in, bishop c3, bishop g4, attacking with queen, queen f2, rook takes pawn check, wins because of a threat of rook d1 mate. So back to the game. G3 was played, and a world champion very logically plays h5, just preparing to attack this new target. And here come the fireworks. So as you can imagine, Larsen wanted to get rid of that knight as quickly as possible, and he played h3. But Spassky comes back with a great move, h4, sacrificing his knight to open the h file. Pawn takes knight, pawn takes on g3. And now Larsen's rook is under attack. We've got this dangerous black pawn on g3, and the king doesn't have many safe squares to run to either. So Larsen played rook g1, obviously better than conceding the h file. Like this, for instance, if we then played knight c3, rook check, bishop has to come back, g2, tried to castle to safety, but then we take, promote to a queen, have to take that off, knight d1, bishop takes, and it's absolutely devastating. So rook g1, and maybe Larsen's expecting queen h4 with the threat of g2 and the discovered check here, but Spassky's prepared something much more deadly, and here we have a sensational move, rook to h1. So he's already sacrificed a knight, and now he's sacrificing a rook as well, and white's pretty much got to take it. If he plays rook f1, then just g2. So rook takes, g2, and Larsen plays rook f1. Now if he plays rook g1, then we get queen check, king d1, and then queen to h1. And the rook can't capture because we retake, queen, bishop has to go to f1, and queen takes his mate. So then you just get queen to c1 to give the king a flight square, queen takes rook, and then we're just going to exchange queens on c1 and then promote to a queen again. So an easy win for black. So Larsen plays rook to f1, but then queen check anyway, king to d1, pawn takes, promotes to a queen. And here Larsen, one of the best players in the world, resigns as white after 17 moves. It's a force mate now. If a bishop takes g4 check, king c1. If he plays bishop e2, then queen h1 is mate, king c1, queen e1, queen has to come in, and we just take, and that's checkmate. So a fantastic game, and if you've got any comments or questions, please leave them below.